All right, so I think we're going to move on to a very interesting segment. It's our first bit of international coverage. International coverage. So this piece that we're going to put on the episode is coming straight out of Eastern Europe, coming straight out of Serbia. We have some foreign correspondents. Ana, she has been doing some coverage on some anti-corruption demonstrations in Serbia, so she's prepared a little segment talking about what's been going on with Serbia and some youth demonstrations in the last year. And we also had a nice conversation with her about her coverage and sort of how it relates to the present moment here in the United States and what we both can learn from one another from thousands and thousands of miles away. Mm-hmm. So I hope you enjoy this segment just as much as we did putting it together and bring it to you.
Since November last year, protests have shaken Serbia after a newly renovated railway station in the city of Novi Sad collapsed, killing 16 people. In the aftermath, students across the country shut down their universities, setting up encampments to demand accountability and sparking the country's biggest uprising in 30 years. The collapse of the railway station wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of a system where profit is king. A system in which corners are cut, safety regulations ignored, and public money is funneled into the hands of the rich. The tragedy in Novi Sad has mobilized millions of people in Serbia and the diaspora because it encapsulates the decadence and depravity of the Serbian ruling elite, which has for decades looted the people's wealth to enrich itself. In the past year alone, every segment of Serbian society has mobilized. Students, workers, farmers, teachers, lawyers, veterans, artists, and more. Now, after a year of sustained protests, the government is trying to criminalize rebellion by making it illegal to block roadways, a tactic that's been central to the movement. But instead of backing down, thousands continue to take to the streets. I spoke with Yulia at a commemorative protest on the 11-month anniversary of the collapse of the railway station about what she thinks this proposed law says about the government.
Okay, so the Serbian government has announced it's trying to change the criminal code to criminalize actions like this right now where we're blocking traffic. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's not only blocking traffic, but also stifling, the freedom of speech regarding liking posts in favor of the protests. So it's precisely that. It's a stifling of civil liberties, all in the guise of, well, I don't know what exactly, guarding the public morale or something like that. But I am, frankly, I'm a bit concerned, but I don't think it will go through, at least I hope not, because, yes, then the government will have effectively declared war on its own people, as if it hasn't been enough for the past almost a year now, actually. So, yes, we'll see what happens. So when it comes to that, I'm sure that most of the people are very, very against it. So yeah.
What's up, y'all? We are here with the Rising Tide podcast, doing our first international segment, international interview. It's a big, auspicious day for counterinsurgent media in the United States. We are branching out. We're going international. And so I'm your co-host, Dayton Du Bois, here with my other co-host,
Dale Smith.
Awesome. And today we are here with Ana, our foreign correspondent calling in from Serbia, a Serbian American, who's also a local correspondent with the Serbian publication Machina, that is going to be talking a little bit today about some popular demonstrations in Serbia in response to some ongoing, corruption, graft, and monopoly capitalism going on in the East. And so I want to hand it over to Ana, who's been covering a series of demonstrations that have been going on in Serbia for the last year. She's going to talk a little bit about the cause of these demonstrations, their development, and a little bit more about freedom of expression in Serbia, because I am sure curious. So go ahead, Ana, take it away.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for having me, Dale and Dayton. Happy to be here. So as is mentioned in the preceding segment about the situation in Serbia, there have been mass protests for almost a year, and we're approaching that year mark, which will be November 1st, as November 1st, 2024 is when the canopy of this recently renovated railway station in Novi Sad collapsed, killing 16 people. And so just thought it would be a really important time and milestone to look back at the last year and talk about, what's been achieved, what are maybe some weaknesses of the mass movement that we're seeing, and also talk a little bit about the relevance for, of course, people in the US, but around the world. So yeah, just a little context. But to go right into some of the repression and attacks on freedom of speech in Serbia. So we have this proposed change to the criminal code right now that hasn't been passed yet, but as is mentioned already, would criminalize, blocking the roads for a protest, any type of political act associated with that, as well as any material online that talks about such blockades of traffic and protests, because it would be seen as inspiring someone to commit that crime. So we have, very clear criminalization of protest on the table here. And the worst part is it's not even the first time. Almost a year ago, even before the collapse of the railway station, the government tried to do the same exact thing, because these blockades and these protests, they're a long-standing tradition in the country, and in the past 5 years, let's say, have also been used to oppose this EU-US led lithium mine that's like very widely unpopular in the country. And for the last 5 years, people have also been protesting that using blockades. So this latest attempt is not, it's not new, it's not unique, but it just shows their desperation, because these protests and the rebellion continues to it continues and continues to intensify with every kind of plunder of the country, every act of repression. So that's a little bit about this particular law, but there's of course other stuff. I don't want to take too long, so
No,
if
no,
you
no,
have
of course. Thank you so much for opening with that. I guess like my first question is, as a person in the United States, like obviously you're here in the United States where there's ways of different repression or demonstrations against certain issues. Particularly, there's been the ongoing 2 years of demonstrations against, the genocide on Palestine. um, Additionally, there's been this sort of growing movement coming in waves of opposition toward ICE and excuse me, and some of our current administrations work around that and and some of these issues that we're sort of seeing with sort of rising criminalization of activism. So I hear you talking about a lot of stuff going on in Serbia. That's just a lot of stuff that's immediately coming to mind as we get into this conversation. Particularly so interesting that it's also an opposition toward this lithium mining project, right? That's also something that we've covered a couple issues episodes ago here on this podcast, specifically as that impacts indigenous American people in the United States. And I think it's a very important crux of like tension in the imperialist system, right? It's a big thing of the West's ongoing, growing inter-imperialist conflict between the United States and China, right? There's a need to outcompete them on all of these rare earth minerals, right? To corner the market on electronics. At the same time, they're incredibly corrupt and decadent, right? They have to cut down the social safety net. They have to get rid of these safety precautions that put people's lives in danger. So they're doing all these things to piss people off, and they need all these new tools to repress the people. So I'm kind of curious, like, what is the landscape for freedom of expression in Serbia at this time? How's it been over the last few years? Obviously, we're all of a particular generation. I'm curious, just a little bit more background of that for some of our Western viewers.
Yeah, thanks, Dayton. So the biggest thing, I guess, in terms of the freedom of expression or media landscape, let's say in Serbia, is that on television, you basically only have pro-government channels that kind of have this national reach, like within the kind of lowest TV package that people can purchase. They only have access to those news sites, right? Or those news channels. They don't have access to some of the oppositional channels, which have their issues for sure. They're both still capitalist, pro-capitalist outlets, but they do critically examine things that the government is doing that you won't see on pro-government channels. And so to get those channels, you have to pay extra. And what does that basically amount to? I mean, for most of the country, which is working class and in rural areas, a lot of rural areas, people are not going to pay extra to have access to those channels. So they basically are in this like media darkness, where they don't really know anything outside of what those channels show them. In particular, of course, for older people. I mean, younger people have social media and whatnot, and I think that's also why the government is looking to criminalize content on those platforms. But basically, that's the kind of general landscape. It's been like that for years. And then I think related to that, one of the major achievements of these protests and the student movement was once the student blockades, started and spread like wildfire across the country. One of the things that they did was that every time there was a new protest in different parts of the country, there would be students that would organize marches, basically going on foot, like hundreds of kilometers between cities to get to this march, to get to this protest. And what that basically means is that they had to go through these small villages, these rural areas that don't really know what's going on, and talk to those people. And it was a huge kind of, I think, breakthrough just in terms of the stranglehold the Serbian government had in terms of their access to information. So
Very interesting point. I think particularly this idea of like going to the countryside, and talking to the rural people about with the movement. It's a very important thing for young people, and something that a lot of young youth movements have a reputation for not doing. Right. So I know, Dale, you had some involvement in some of our U.S. student movement that had a lot of occupations in the last year or so. I'm curious your thoughts on some of this.
I mean, I guess what's coming up for me is like, does it seem like there's a lot of enthusiasm among the students to like kind of explain the situation to a lot of the different, folks they're encountering as they're making way to their protests? Is there a lot of hesitancy towards that? And I guess kind of like further than that, like, are there like, clear lines of like division of like what people think can come from these protests and like what, lines are being put forward in, how people are like coming together to organize?
yeah, I think really the students have been more than happy to and really gone out of their way to connect with people in the villages, in the smaller areas. And you'll see that when they have these like welcoming ceremonies, when students will come to spend the night or something, and people in the village and whatnot will, offer accommodation and all of this stuff. You'll see poorer people, older people who have basically nothing, using the little money they have to bring these students like food or drinks or something like that. And yeah, you can just see that they're so happy, and they're basically like welcoming these students as liberators, is what we've heard from many people that live in these areas. And it's really been essential, I think, to countering the government's propaganda of, oh, these people are just terrorists. They want to ruin Serbia. They want to. I mean, it's a classic line, right? Equating opposition dissent with terrorism. But once you're talking face to face with these students that are protesting, it's quite hard to then be like, yes, they're terrorists that just want the worst for us. So in that sense, yeah, it's been really important to see that bridge being built. And then, yeah, in terms of what's gonna come of this whole movement, I mean, that's I guess, $1 million question, if we will. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit just because the movement a year ago versus now is very different in a lot of ways. And one of those is that the goals have kind of shifted. So in the beginning, these students, they came out with these four demands, which were basically release the documentation related to the train collapse, prosecute those who are accountable, you know, those corrupt politicians, release the people who are imprisoned at protests about the train station collapse, and finally increase education funding by 20%. So these were their first main demands that everyone rallied around. But within a few months, people were kind of like, okay, what next? Where do we go next? And the students released this statement basically saying, well, the next step is on everyone else, and it's on all of us to become more self-organized, to come together, to not rely on this representative parliamentarian democracy, so-called democracy, which relates to the fact that in the beginning the students basically disavowed any collaboration with existing opposition parties, which are also, you know, joint oppressors of the people. And that was really important. That was, I think, a culmination of decades of seeing these politicians sell people out, right, time and time again, and people saying, you know, it's on us actually to take this in our hands and not just elect someone to change this. And the whole rhetoric was like, you know, we're not against one government, one regime, we're against this whole system, even though the kind of the articulation is not so coherent as to what system in particular, just the system. You know, I would argue, of course, like the capitalist system that is in place is you know, fundamental to the oppression people here face. That hasn't come out so much in this movement. But in particular, a year ago, that was kind of more on the table, kind of thinking about big picture changes, right? And so all of these things were, I think, great progressive achievements, but because of the lack of kind of coherent leadership, and I would argue communist leadership, these protests have kind of they're searching for a way out, and the only way out that they know is elections. And so what happens in May of 2025? The students announce a new demand, and it's elections. And basically since then, it's just been kind of more or less this political roulette, political game of, okay, you know, we've achieved all of this and we have so many people that support us. Now let's go and, you know, use it at the polling stations, whatever. But of course, the president has to then call for these emergency elections, and of course he's not. And so we're in this, you know, long cycle of, you know, waiting, basically. And you know, to me, it's unfortunate, and it's kind of you know, a misguided, I think, direction. But I think the only way the people learn through these movements is to try different things and see for themselves what works and what doesn't. So while I personally don't really believe in that kind of direction, you know, it's on the people to figure that out. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but
No, no, no. I think it's all a very important context, right? And I think it's also an important connection you're drawing there, because I think for a lot of young people here in the States, we've seen almost a very similar pattern, right, of these spontaneous movements coming about, obviously historically, but even just in the last 2 years, right, in response to very acute issues. You know, in the United States, there's been a big movement against, you know, the genocide in Gaza, as we said before, and of course the ongoing attack on immigrants through these ramping up of ICE. And you see a lot of these spontaneous demonstrations coming up for a while, but then time and time again they come up with this brick wall. You know, how do we get around the fact that the whole system is guilty for this stuff, right? And you see how in a capitalist society in particular, like that elections are just like the biggest thing that people are really just trained to do. You know, people just have no real conception. You know, it's like how many conversations I've had in the last couple of weeks where it's like, oh, are there any good politicians we should support for midterms? And it's like, no, absolutely not. There's none. There's no one we could elect to end, you know, the last several decades of this strategy and policy, right? It's not an issue of like the individual temperament of politicians. But we see that without larger revolutionary leadership, that's really, you know, what people kind of resign themselves toward, you know. I think the Palestine solidarity movements are a good example. You have like a whole mass of people, and for their perception is that they've just been marching in circles for 2 years, and so they're really just looking for anybody that will just say 2 + 2 = 4, that could possibly support. I think a good example is like, you have the big wave of popular support for local politicians like Zoran Mamdani, who like has like the most bare minimum of a progressive agenda, very bare minimum of a progressive agenda. He just, he's the mayor of New York. He promised to visit New Yorkers in their homes and not go to Israel. Right. And then he was essentially crucified in the news for saying he wouldn't visit another country as the mayor of a major American city. Right. And, we look into his policies. He's basically still just a classic YIMBY. He's just, he's still like a YIMBY Democrat, while he is part of DSA. And, we've seen politicians before, and it's like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is another famous New York example. Here in Oakland, where I'm coming from, we just recalled our last so-called leftist mayor for corruption charges, for her relationship to organized crime. What's up, Sheng Tao? And so she's probably going to go to prison, hopefully. Hopefully, maybe at least one of them will go to prison. One of these corrupt politicians will go to prison. If anyone's going to go to prison, it should be them. But not to divulge the point, but we see that without this larger organized leadership, right, or just organization at all, that can really educate people and impart these historical lessons, people just go around in circles. Right. And so I think, oftentimes that's why I really chide and squirm whenever I hear that word self-organization. It's like we have to get self-organized. And it's like, oh, the average person doesn't know how to organize themselves. Right. So that's why we require help from others, basic solidarity. And so I think that's like the one thing that we really have to hope for in all these spontaneous demonstrations, that if we could understand that the system is guilty, then how do we develop revolution organization that can tackle that whole system? So I want to pass it over to Dale before we move on to our next question.
Yeah, I think it's really positive that like the students have like shown a lot of like willingness to like go out there and like talk to people. I think like that's something that I even saw really consistently is like during the Palestinian solidarity encampments, like there was like a lot of like working class folks and like regular folks who were supportive of that. And so there was like a clear basis for folks to actually go out there and like start talking to people, but that unfortunately consistently seems to be the sort of failing point of a lot of student protests and student movements is like there is a huge hesitancy for people to take their politics off of campus, outside of these activist circles and established activist spaces, and into communities, into working class institutions and such. So it does sound really positive that there is that element to the protests and that there is like a progressive character to the protests, but I definitely agree, there are a lot of the same shortcomings that we see even here in the United States. So
Yeah, definitely. And just to note, like, in terms of this appeal by the students for people to get organized, it didn't actually just fall on deaf ears. Like, people actually did form these neighborhood councils, like grassroots city councils that were, removed from these traditional, places of power. And those have like blossomed across the country. Like in every city, any neighborhood, you'll find one of them, and they're talking about things that are affecting people, whether it's things in the neighborhood like the street is a tree has fallen, or something as banal as that, or relating to these protests and demands against the government. So I think there definitely have been these achievements, but whether or not the politics within those continue to be progressive or they get kind of co-opted by opportunists is yet to be seen. But I think that was, if I can just highlight, like one of the biggest achievements of this is that people really see the need to do something themselves and are in a large part. But yeah, of course, as we already said, still like a lot of limitations, but just to add that.
The situation with these neighborhood councils is something very important to keep tabs on as these months develop, right? Because the issue that I see is that this stuff's only getting worse internationally right now in terms of like the global pull toward the right, the sort of the floundering of the U.S. imperialism and its sort of frantic attempts to sort of keep up with the other the other imperialist interests like China and Russia, as well as trying to keep the other junior imperialists like the European Union in line as well, right? And so as this sort of struggle develops, we're only going to see more of these contradictions sort of coming to the fore. And so the real question is like how are the masses of people going to be able to take on that challenge? How are they going to actually try to solve some of these questions? How are they going to advance and develop this movement? And can we have more international solidarity with people around the world? So I'm trying to check to my next question. So I'm curious, and we're getting close to wrapping up. So I wanted to ask, like, just what's your sense of some of the student groups that were involved in the early part of the protest? I think we got 1 year since the train station collapse coming up in almost 2 weeks at this time of recording, right? So what are the student groups like, when they started? What were their composition, and where are they at now? Because you talked a little about them folks backing candidates. I'm curious a little more how you saw that development.
Yes. So also something I wanted to mention when the blockade started is that these student blockades basically emerged in competition with these existing like student parliaments, which were completely corrupted and completely just, subservient to the, university administrations, which is tied up with the government. Go
We
ahead.
know a lot about those corrupt
Yes.
student org.
Yes. Yes, but it was huge because then you have 60 of 80 universities, new groups popping up and saying, no, we actually represent the students and the masses of the students are behind us. They're engaging in this new form of organization. And so just in terms of the composition, I mean, like every faculty has its own, they call them plenums because this is the main way they're organizing. They have these plenary sessions, and that's basically where these debates are happening, these votes, like trying to, practice democratic decision making. So every faculty more or less has one of these, but there's different, I think, uh, political positions depending on which faculty you go to and read their statements. Like, for example, the philosophy faculty is known for these very um, controversial left-leaning statements where they have consistently since the beginning come out and like distance themselves from different like NGOs and denounce them from trying to what they say co-opt the movement. So then you have those, which of course then more liberals are say things like, oh, they're being paid to do this, paid by I don't know who, by anyways, as a way to like discredit these very valid criticisms actually of these NGOs that either are aligned with the opposition or they're funded by the US government, et cetera, which is also very interesting because the society here does have a pretty deep distrust of these NGOs, especially after the 2000 overthrow of Milosevic. And afterwards, it was uncovered that some of these NGOs that were working to overthrow him were directly financed by the U.S. government. So the students at that the philosophy faculty kind of like I think tapped into that, and they had these political positions that people disagreed with, and there was a lot of discussion and debate. There still is to this day about that. And then you have other faculties that maybe are more liberal and they just kind of call on the EU to intervene, this sort of thing. So it's a huge hodgepodge, right? Like it's the student movement, it's not one thing. There's these segments to it. And it's been this kind of ideological struggle within it, I think, since the beginning, up until when elections were announced as the new demand for the student movement, and then kind of I think that line became more dominant within it. So now those are kind of the forces at the helm. So just a little food for thought.
Oh my goodness. Yes, the United States loves its nonprofit organizations. They love its NGOs. I think that's such an interesting, I think it's a very modern tool of global imperialism right now is the NGO, particularly in the attempts to sort of co-opt grassroots activism. Here in the United States, activists are always in this conversation, pretend conversation, really, in my personal opinion, around resources, right? Where are we going to get the resources to do the work that needs to be done, right? Which again, like, these are all very opaque questions. What is the work that needs to be done? How are we going to do that? And that determines like the resources, right? I would argue most of the time, grassroots organizations, the resources we need are political, right? It's not necessarily like a new office space or catered meals at every demonstration, right? And I think, thinking back to some folks who were active during the George Floyd demonstrations, it was quite sickening to see, actually, that after several weeks of grassroots demonstrations, you start seeing all these Penske rental trucks showing up in major cities across the world with so-called grassroots activists claiming they're not a part of any major established organizations, but they have all this mystery funding, right? And from the George Floyd protests from 2020 on to now, we've seen in the United States just an explosion of community nonprofits and NGOs, trying to engage in social work and social activism, really often playing the role of the state, right? Really trying to divert popular attention into electoral politics behind candidates. And that is, like, I think, and particularly again in capitalist countries, it's such a key thing to understand for these grassroots demonstrations, that often what the state can't do with boots, with guns, with politicians and men in suits, they'll just send, so-called community activists with NGO funding, right? And use that NGO funding as sort of like a carrot to get tired, confused grassroots activists to give up and join the system through like a couple of degrees of separation.
I mean, I definitely think like this is interesting because this isn't something that's always existed. It's definitely a fairly recent phenomenon, possibly mostly within, the past 40 years or so. And also, it's interesting to me because, like, I do think that even here domestically in the United States, there is a lot of skepticism around NGOs, but then there's also still the willingness for a lot of activists and newer, groups coming about to tail these NGOs, because people really don't see any different way of doing things. So there's a supreme irony in that you're describing the situation that you're seeing, but also like I think it's important to understand that it's like it's not unique to one country, one area. This is like a trend that we're seeing all over. So.
Yes, it's an international trend. It's a tool used internationally to oppress the working class. And so we're kind of approaching the end of our segment. So I just wanted to, one, thank you, Ana, for speaking with us today. This has been a very enlightening conversation. We want to keep our eyes peeled for further developments coming out of the East, coming out of Serbia. And we look forward to having you back on the program.
Thank you guys. Always a pleasure.